Welcome to this series of tutorials on how newsrooms can combat online harassment and abuse of their journalists. The first tutorial will focus on understanding the problem as it appears in your own newsroom. The second will focus on prevention. How can you minimise the risk of online abuse to your journalists? The third tutorial will look at recovery. What can you do when a journalist is targeted online? And the fourth will help you put all of this together into a roadmap for your newsroom. It will help you see what next steps you need to take, who will be responsible for taking them, and it will help you identify any training needs you might have. Each tutorial is solutions oriented. The hope is that you, the participants, will generate a new protocol that you can use in your own newsroom to protect your own journalists, drawing on the resources that IPI have provided. But first of all, why should newsrooms have a protocol to deal with online abuse and harassment at all? There has been a growing awareness and recognition in our industry that online abuse and harassment is a workplace issue, as well as an issue for individual journalists. It is a workplace issue, partly because newsrooms have a duty of care to their employees. We know that online abuse and harassment causes harm. We also know that online abuse and harassment has a chilling effect. Media organisations want to publish a range of people and a range of opinions, and online abuse and harassment makes that more difficult. We also want to protect the reputation of our titles. We want people to trust our journalism as well as our journalists. An attack on our journalists is an attack on our journalism. In this first tutorial, I want you to think about what abuse looks like in your newsroom. What form does it take? And what effect does it have on those targeted and on the organisation as a whole? To set the scene, I want to first try to capture the nature of online harassment and abuse visually, to impose some sense of order and what can seem an overwhelming situation. This map attempts to capture what online harassment looks like, the range of things that we're talking about here. So attacks can represent a low or high level of immediate threat. They can also be high in volume or frequency, or low in volume or frequency. The level of threat, the frequency and the volume will partly determine the seriousness of the attack. In most circumstances, most journalists can receive a small number of low-level threats without any real harm being done. And of course, most people would find any number of high-level threats intolerable. But a large number of low-level threats can also be traumatising to the individual, as can a single threat if it is credible enough. But there are other important factors too. Where the harassment takes place makes a difference. If it's on the newsroom's own platform, where the organisation has more control, it is easier to deal with. If it is off-platform, on social media or other sites, as well as in real life, the organisation has less control over these spaces, and this can therefore cause more damage. And where the target is when the attack takes place matters too. Are they at home, alone, at work, surrounded by colleagues? Are they out on a job, perhaps in an already frightening situation? What the journalist has experienced in the past is also significant, as is their psychological state prior to the attack. Journalists who have prior experience of racist attacks or sexual assaults in real life, for example, are likely to find racist or sexual threats online harder to brush off. And if someone is already very anxious or depressed, then they might be more vulnerable to online harassment. And if they are alone, with no one to support them, the impact is likely to be more intense. In other words, the nature of the abuse itself is significant, but so too is the context in which the journalist is working, both where they are, what stories they're working on, and how the abuse is experienced. This experience of abuse will be influenced by all sorts of factors, including the target's prior experiences, their temperament, their circumstances. We know that online harassment and abuse is very often gendered and racialised. Women and people of colour tend to receive more personal attacks. Women receive threats of sexual violence as well as torrents of dismissive comments, "You're useless, you're a silly woman," and so on. Journalists of colour receive racial slurs. And because women and people of colour also experience sexism and racism offline, including physical assaults, this kind of abuse can be particularly frightening, even traumatic. And the impact, the harm online attacks do, is therefore contextual. It is always a result of the interaction between online and offline, external events and internal feelings and responses. Nothing is ever just virtual. Our responses cannot be just virtual either. IPI's protocol is based on the belief that dealing effectively with online abuse is as much about the culture and practices in the newsroom as it is about technical fixes. An effective response will be a blend of the cultural and the technical. Having gathered examples of best practice in other newsrooms, IPI have drawn up a 4-step protocol to support targeted journalists that draws on these structures and support mechanisms. An effective institutional response will include all 4 steps and needs to be flexible enough to deal with the different scenarios and different personalities and situations. So what are the 4 steps? Step 1 is reporting. It's very important to establish clear reporting lines and a culture of safety in the newsroom that encourages journalists to report. Step 2 is risk assessment. It's important to train those who receive those reports to assess risk, recognise harms and act proportionately. Step 3 is about implementing support mechanisms. It's important to have informal and formal mechanisms in place to support your journalists, whatever their level of risk. And the final step, step 4, is tracking and reassessment. You need some kind of record-keeping process so that you can see what abuse is happening, where it's happening, who it's happening to, and that you can keep assessing your own responses to make sure that it's working. An effective institutional response will include all 4 steps in some form and needs to be flexible enough to deal with different scenarios and different personalities and situations. In this first video tutorial, we'll focus on mapping how things are in your particular newsroom right now. In order to design a protocol for your organisation, you need to be able to answer various questions. Who has been or is being targeted? Are some journalists more at risk than others? Who and why? What form do the attacks take and where do they appear? What do you know about the perpetrators? What's the impact, personal and professional? Is the person being targeted getting any support, and if so, what and where from? And how does your newsroom currently respond to such attacks in practice? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of your current approach? Sadly, we know that many journalists don't report online attacks to their employers. Some don't even tell colleagues what's happening. There are many reasons for this. It might be because they've reported online abuse in the past and nothing was done. It might be because they fear it will have a negative impact on their career. In particular, many female journalists, as well as people of colour, report that their experiences of gendered and racialised online abuse are not taken seriously by their white male colleagues who have not experienced it. They are told to toughen up or to grow a thicker skin. So by asking all your journalists to tell you about the experiences online, you will also be sending a message that the organisation takes this seriously and wants to combat it. In short, asking journalists to tell you what's happening to them is the first step in creating a culture of safety around online harassment in your newsroom. In most organisations, this will involve surveying all staff and regular freelancers. Surveying staff sends 2 important messages. First of all, it helps debunk the widespread feeling that being targeted with abuse on social media is the new normal for journalists. And second, it gives journalists a sense of security that the media organisation they work for wants to support them. So your first task is to design a newsroom survey. We've found it's useful if this survey is anonymous, so that people feel able to speak freely. We found it's helpful if it's sent by the editor-in-chief or someone in a similar powerful position in the organisation, along with a clear statement that he or she does not believe that abuse and harassment should be tolerated, and that it is understood that that abuse and harassment is often gendered and racialised, and that it can have serious negative impacts on the well-being of the person who is targeted. You need to make it clear that the organisation wants to discover how they can better support staff. Again, by doing this, the editor-in-chief is making it clear that the media organisation takes online attacks seriously. This will build confidence in the newsroom and will send important messages. So make sure you state the purpose of the survey, that you want to improve the organisation's response. This survey should include questions that cover the following areas. Who has been targeted and how often? What's the nature of the attacks? What's the impact been? Have the attacks been reported? If not, why not? And if so, what has the response been? In the resource pack that accompanies this video, you'll find examples of surveys you could use or adapt for your own newsroom. The survey will give you a snapshot of what journalists have experienced and the impact that it's having on them personally and professionally. You might also follow up by having a series of conversations with people who might throw more light on what is happening on the ground. Is there a journalist you know who has been the target of a prolonged or serious online assault? If so, do talk to them. Ask them to tell you what your organisation could have done better to support them. Is there a member of the editorial team who deals with community or social media who might have an interesting perspective? Speak to them too. Have they observed any patterns in the abusive behaviour that might inform your organisation's response in the future? The second task is to do a newsroom audit. That is, you need to map the strengths and weaknesses of your newsroom's response as it is right now. You need to capture things such as your existing reporting systems, the training your journalists have already been given, any support mechanisms that are already in place, and so on. We've produced a worksheet in the resources that accompany this video, which will help you to give you a sort of guide to how to do this. The next thing you need to do is to consider who in your organisation does these things at the moment, and if there are any important roles that are not being carried out by anybody. Here again, you need to focus on how things are right now. The idea is to map the people's roles and responsibilities as they currently exist and look for gaps and training needs as well as bottlenecks. So to summarise, online harassment and abuse is best seen as a workplace issue. The nature of the attacks is important, but so is the context. Nothing is ever just virtual, so our responses cannot be just technological. An effective response will be cultural as well as technological. IPI's 4-step protocol, reporting, risk assessment, support and tracking, can help provide a basis for your own protocol. But in order to design an effective protocol for your own newsroom, you will need to discover what your journalists are experiencing online, identify the steps your organisation has already taken, and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of your current approach. To do this, you'll need to survey your staff and regular freelancers, have follow-up conversations to explore the issues raised by the survey, and audit your existing response. Complete these steps before moving on to tutorial 2. In the resource pack that accompanies this video, you'll find a worksheet to help you do this. You might also spend some time exploring the On the Line website, where you'll find a lot more resources that might help you understand the nature of the problem, the harm it does, and what steps others have successfully taken to combat it.